let me once again welcome all of you and also introduce the topic a little bit and then introduce the speaker for today. The topic that we are dealing with is one of the very first that we thought about when we thought about a webinar, and even when we thought about a special issue, because one of the consequences of us being in a neoliberal moment where economic growth is sort of highlighted as almost being synonymous with development is that social policy gets lost, and then people are also confused as to how economic policy and social policy can together work to give us the kind of improvements in the human condition that we all want to see in our countries. So we thought that this was very appropriate to sort of establish why social policy is important and how it can interact with economic policy to give us not just good development, but also gender equitable development. So that's the topic for today, the symbiosis between social and economic policies for gender equitable development. And our speaker is Mr. Charles Ebugri, who I should mention is also on the technical committee of the GESFA project because of his expertise that is really needed. He's a development economist and currently the executive director of the International Development Economics Association, IDEAS, which is a global network of heterodox economists and political economists. He was previously the CEO of the Savannah Accelerated Development Authority here in Ghana, called SADA, and a commissioner at the National Development Planning Commission in Ghana, and also the regional director for the UN Millennium Campaign at the UNDP, the head of global advocacy and policy at Christian Aid UK, and research fellow at Swansea University, among other positions that he's held, which altogether, just the various locations, national and international, within the public sector, within the civil society sector, and all of that, give him the kind of experience I think that will make this talk very rich. He's associated also with the founding of several NGOs, non-governmental organizations in Ghana and beyond. And his research interests include economic inequalities, development finance, and development management. Mr. Ebugri has been given up to 45 minutes for the topic, after which we will have conversation around it for another 30 minutes, depending on the number of questions, the number of comments and engagements that people want to have around the topic. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Ebugri to share his slides and begin his talk. Thank you. And as he's getting ready to speak, let me just say that you don't have to wait till the end for the conversation to start. We have a chat session. You can put in your comments or your questions as they come to you. And when he's done, we'll go back to them and have him answer them. Or you can chat among yourself. That's always a very interesting part of these discussions also. All right, Mr. Ebugri, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me get rid of this. There's always this. Okay, found it. Thanks, Prof. I don't know whether you can see me. I tried to put my video on, but I can't see myself
very clearly.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to share some reflections. I have reformulated this very slightly, and I'll explain why I did so. I reformulated it to address a lot more on the conceptual side of it, more than the policy side of the assignment you gave me, although towards the end of the presentation, I will make some remarks regarding implications for social policy and economic policy for gender equitable development. I wanted to concentrate a little bit more on the conceptual because in order to make one principal point, which is that it is difficult to separate the economic and the social arenas. And that social policy is by nature integral to economic policy and economic system, just like the economic system is founded on the social system. And so it is an understanding of how the two interact that gives a chance for policy on both sides to lead to transformative gender relations. So if get lost in these conceptual things, please keep that in mind. That's the principal point I wanted to make. Now, so the first point I wanted to make is that the dominant character, I wanted to start with the economic side of things, that the dominant character of contemporary economics, what we know about economics and what is mostly taught in economic departments, is concentrates really on prices and exchange. It's a very trade-related focus. And when it comes to allocation of resources, it's really about how the price mechanism drives the allocation of resources for different purposes, and therefore, generates economic growth. I think Kuya made the point that in this neoliberal era, and this has been going on way back for quite a while, that the focus on economic policy is very much about growth, and about growth, the focus on growth is really how the price mechanism mediates this. And this is the pure sense of what a market economy is about. But the factors, the elements of the economic system that matters most for our purposes relates to how society is organized and the nature in which resources are controlled, the relationship between the theory, how knowledge is claimed and utilized, the social system and the social policies that arise from that, and the problem of order, how a society generates or doesn't, the conditions for freedoms, and the social hierarchies and relationships that emerge from them. These things tend to be mentioned tangentially, but I would argue that, in fact, the historical basis of economics is rooted in these more broader mechanisms. Now, the second point I wanted to make to build on the first is that economic activity is in fact a social event, legitimized, and its legitimacy is regulated by whether or not there is some social justice in that activity. So from the very beginning, and I did this back to Plato and Aristotle, not Adam Smith, as the founders of most of these concepts that have come to become economic concepts and an understanding of economic activity, that from that very beginning, it is understood that economic activity is in fact a social event. It has meaning only in relation to its contribution to a good life, the choice of the value to be created. But the legitimacy of what is being created lies in the question, for what value is created, for whom is value created, and for whose purposes is value destroyed in that process of creation or not. As you know, in economics, if you break down a building and you do not replace that building, the very nature or fact of breaking down the building, the resources put into it, the time put into it, generates economic growth. It doesn't necessarily generate value, additional value in terms of quality of life, but it generates economic growth. So, but in this context, economic activity actually has value when it relates to social life. So a just social life. So it is a cooperative process of creating value based on the division of labor and the distribution of the goods arising from this division of labor. And this question of the centrality of division of labor, we will touch a little bit more on it, and it is central to our understanding of the drivers of inequitable gender relations. The same is true for the side effects accompanying the production of what some people call ungoods or evils. So you go to war or you destroy an environment. In those destructive processes still adds to economic growth, but the actual impact on society is negative. So decisions among society people, conflicts arise from the the tensions in the allocation of the advantages and disadvantages arising out of this economic activity. But to resolve these, there are only two ways to resolve this in society. You resolve this either through power and might, or in accordance with what some people call the moral principle. Now, the moral principle subjects the regulation of conflicting claims in a society and conflicting interests to some measure, and that measure that justifies in economic activity is justice, and social justice or environmental justice. This basically is the ethical basis or the criterion for the social acceptability of any economic activity. If you think about it, if you keep felling trees, you keep destroying and polluting the environment, although you make personal wealth out of it, it comes to a point that the impact on the society generally is negative, and the society will not accept it. Conflicts will arise from your use of that particular resource. And so that basis of social justice is the ethical criterion in which economic action is measured. Now, for that reason, economic activity must be regulated to be just. So this legitimacy condition of economic activities requires that the economic activity, be regulated by and guided by this, this moral suasion and institutions with the responsibility of correcting and guiding an economic activity for the social good. So in a well-ordered society, the norms of justice are valid for everyone, and they are both morally and legally binding. By well-ordered society, I mean a society that is civil, that where conflicts are settled by negotiation and cooperation rather than by force and by war. And this is an essential foundation of social policy and the normative core of the universal human rights instruments. So the concept of an economic citizen treats the citizen both as a moral person because that person's action must be guided by this moral compass that it provides and produces the social good and social justice, as well as an economic agent seeking to improve the quality of life for oneself and so on. So there's not a sense of an economic being or citizen that is divorced, whose responsibilities and actions are completely divorced from the guidance of its impact on society. So in fact, the activity itself is justifiable and is legitimated by these conditions of justice. Okay, now social policy is meant to address and be the mechanism for guiding economic activity. That is private intervention for private good, guiding it to ensure that there is a balance between the economic agents, that is the benefits of the individual as a player in the economy for private good, and social justice. And the mechanisms of economic policy can be, basically corrective, which is palliative, or it can be transformational. And it is argued that real transformative social policy unleashes three freedoms: the freedom, in relation to one's security, personal, family, community security, the freedom to own property, but regulated by the impacts of that ownership, and the freedom to take advantage, the ability to take advantage of opportunity in just like others do. And this type of transformative social policy, what it does, contrasts a little bit with the narrow formal freedoms as is embedded in neoliberal economics, which is really about property rights, and personal security. So in a sense, social policy, by being either corrective or transformative, is the mechanism for rebalancing the ensuring the social good in economic activity. Now, the other thing I wanted, so that's the part of the economy, regulated, economic activity regulated by the social system. So, but you could say that the economic systems that emerge from this whole process are themselves founded on social systems. So if you take a look at any form of economic system, whether you are talking about feudal systems or traditional systems that are driven by largely patriarchal relationships, or you are talking about the market and so-called competitive economy, or more cooperative forms of economic organization, such as socialism or communism or social democratic, forms of organizing the economy, that all of these systems, are rooted in fundamental social systems. So the feudal economic system is rooted in the history of all sorts of customs in the past in Britain, which was founded on the power of the lords, and that created certain customs and social norms that then generated a whole range of rights and repressions, of which the repression of the serfs, by the lords is a dramatic situation. But you could say the same thing about traditional systems that define divisions of labor at the household and defines a narrative of power, and social rules that basically, lead to the repression of women's rights and children's rights, for example. So those are social systems. It's the same you see in a so-called a competitive economic system, That too has specific power relationships that benefit some groups, and that the whole process of accumulation, as rooted in a competitive so-called market economy, requires some different types of repression and inequitable power and the distribution of the benefits of labor that enables that accumulation process to happen. Therefore, so to understand the economy, you have to understand the social system on which that particular economic system is founded. And of course, there's no particular economic system is founded on one social system, and there's continuous emergence. But there is dominant social systems that drive the way the power relations are shaped in an economic system. Also note, I made the point earlier that economic value is largely derived from labor value. Now, so the economic system is founded on social systems, but at the heart of it is the way labor is organized, rewarded or not rewarded or exploited. And so that labor system of value, which is basically the use in a very pure traditional system, closed autarkic system, you basically use people's labor, to tend the land or animals, and that generates value. And and the various sophistications that added, whether you think about machinery as capital, a fiscal good, or machinery actually as reproduced labor, which is the creativity of labor. Either way, at the heart of the creation of economic value is labor. And these concepts, of course, was is very much associated with Adam Smith, but Marx and Ricardo actually built a lot more on how this system of labor exploitation actually is the source of accumulation of capital. And this is the foundation of the concepts of just price or unjust price, not just exchange or unjust exchange in political economy. How labor is rewarded in the process of creating value. So therefore, in any social system that devalues parts of labor, whether it's slavery, it is serfdom, or it is patriarchy, that system exploits part of labor in order to create an accumulation process, which is basically what capital is supposed to be. But it is in this process the value is created and value is distributed. Now, and it is in this process, through the division of labor, that so-called economic growth, which is the accumulation of value, happens. Now, so now that takes me to conceptually what the feminist approach to social and economic policy is, noting the journey we have traveled so far, which is the embeddedness of the economic system and social system, and the influences of both on each other going forward. So as you all know, the feminist approach to social and economic policy, there's a central premise is the sexual division of labor. So I have been talking about division of labor, which is regulated, earlier, either by force and power, which is subjugation, and traditionally, and in the case of feminist analysis, it is that subjugation is in the way in which sexual division of labor is rewarded or not rewarded. And this shapes the way the economy is organized. It shapes policy decisions and results in different outcomes for men and women. Now, social policies, such as the traditional welfare policies that are blind to these sexual divisions of labor and how that operates at the household and community level, even no matter how well intended, could end up at best being palliative and at worst actually exacerbating gender relations, in the sense that it can basically create a palliative arrangement for deeper uh, exploitation of women, as we know, as happens in the way reproductive and domestic work is not rewarded. So in a sense, that still builds on this whole question of the social system and how the social system defines the way of how value that is created by labor is divided. And in the case of feminist analysis, that the key driver is the way the sexual division of labor is rewarded and not rewarded. Now, so it takes me to the labor market. So we've spoken, I've spoken a little bit about how the traditional systems and reward and reward different forms of labor. And in the case of gender equality, actually penalizes women at the rewards women at the expense of women, rewards men at the expense of women's labor. But in the labor market, which is in the formal labor market, the central premise of okay, sorry. So I made that point. So I wanted to just make that to make the point, following on the earlier slide, that the way in which the labor market, the inequalities and gender inequalities in the labor market reflects is in many ways, it reflects in the participation between men and women, boys and girls in the labor market, the participation of girls and boys in the formal system of education that generally shapes the labor markets of the future. It reflects in women's work, the fact that women often work shorter hours and in more informal jobs and so on. The key point here is that as a reflection of inequality, the gender pay gap, which very few countries measure, is a very interesting reflection of the underlying drivers of gender inequality, because it reflects various cumulative factors of power and inequalities of power at multiple levels of society. So on the table that I was just sharing, the Gambia and Sierra Leone, for example, that the differences between men's wages and women's wages is over 40% in favor of men. And this is increasingly difficult even to know, because labor market statistics hardly measure the wage gap. You mostly have a sense of labor market participation rates at different levels, but not how work is rewarded. Now, having made the point that the underlying drivers of gender inequalities lies in both in the interaction between the social system and the economic system, and that social policy is the mechanism for realigning a society using the economic activity or otherwise, realigning the society towards social justice, which is actually the legitimizer and the ethical justification for economic activity. And that for that social policy to be more than palliative, we have to deal with remunerative work at all levels. And remunerative work at the level of the household, remunerative work at the level of the community, and remunerative work at the level of the formal economic institutions. And so this definition and clarity of what remunerative work is and the nature of that remuneration to ensure a life of dignity for all and the creation of opportunities, equitable opportunities, is the key challenge in addressing the labor market. Now, we also know that, as indicated earlier, the labor market is a manifestation of several of various dimensions of power relations and opportunities, of which education, skill trading at a higher level, and gender-defined skills allocation are the main context and drivers of inequitable access to higher remunerative jobs. So the education and skill training question is central to the use of social policy for transformative change. Of course, universal provisioning of basic health, education, and social protection, including social security provision, are the essential building blocks for a future of more competitive and greater participation of women in higher education and higher skills, and therefore higher paid jobs. And this, of course, because it's a power relations question, this then requires attention for organizing and protestation and influence and lobbying and advocacy. And of course, it requires, because the relations of economic relations and that shape gender relations are a lifelong issue, it requires an imaginative thinking of social protection that also addresses the question of pension and social security throughout the life cycle of citizens. So those are some elements of, but in doing so, just a few highlights. It is important to recognize that first and foremost, as this is built on the economy, that the ability to shape the labor market also depends very much on the system, the economic system that creates that labor market. So an exploitative capitalist system will by nature shape itself to ensure that there is that exploitation of labor and the appropriation of the surplus value of labor, and increasingly is women's labor, is essentially built into it. This is why neoliberalism is not so much only an economic policy of liberalizing markets. It's an economic policy of ensuring that those who control capital control public policy, and therefore the conditions of labor are shaped for the purpose of maximizing the accumulation by capital. And it reflects also in macroeconomic policy, the fear that public expenditure brings inflation, and that inflation is not a good thing. Therefore, it is better to sacrifice expenditure for lower inflation. Lower inflation, of course, benefit those who have capital and assets, because inflation is actually a tax on those assets, and inflation diminishes those assets for asset holders. But inflation could be very beneficial for smallholder producers in the farm, and therefore inflation itself is a power power relations issue. So understanding the power of public expenditure as a tool for transformative social policy is absolutely crucial. And that also is related to two different things. One is how you create money for public expenditure. And I think, and one of the areas that monetary policy by neoliberals have scared and continue to dominate the arena for public policy choices on financing development is the role of the central bank and the creation of money. The view that if you print money, which is basically you borrow from the central bank, again, it leads to something that is terrible, which is inflation. But in that, so alternatively, you should not borrow from the central bank, which is domestic money, which is created, which is local currency denominated, your own money. You should go and borrow from foreign markets, which are foreign exchange denominated, which gives you two problems. It gives you a debt problem. It also gives you a foreign exchange problem, meaning that you are taxing people to buy foreign exchange in order to transfer, meaning you are constantly running after foreign exchange rate stability, in order that when you tax people and you raise the money, that the exchange rate remains stable. Otherwise, you more money goes into purchasing fewer dollars. So this perception that the creation of domestic money through domestic money market, including the central bank, is a bad thing, but borrowing externally is a good thing. It's one of these myths that have continued to strangle government's ability to spend money for transformative social policies. And then there is the reform of the domestic capital markets themselves. As we know, there is very little work that's been done on domestic asset accumulation and asset distribution, who owns what wealth. So wealth distribution and the gender distribution of wealth and assets. And that means that, the power, gender inequality in the economy is increasingly driven by the inequitable access to assets, and including financial assets. Who plays in the stock market? Who owns the banks? Who has the most, investment capital, and so on and so forth. Those are the foundations, and who owns most of the land, and so on, that eventually can then be, liquefied into cash. And these are the key fundamental transformational questions that have got to things that have got to happen in the economy for social policy to be possible, and for transformative social policy to be possible. But to conclude, it also means that we do need to keep in mind that there is a normative, there is a normative boundary for economic activity. It is not acceptable for economic activity to drive inequalities. It undermines the normative condition for economic activity. Therefore, being conscious about multiple inequalities that drive and are driven by gender inequalities in general is an essential precondition for space to be created for gender equitable social transformation. Okay, so I'll stop there. Am I still there? Hello? Hello?
Yes, please, you are still in.
Oh, okay. I thought I had dropped off and I was rambling on by myself. I have concluded.
Hello.
Yes, Akram. I came to an end a moment ago.
Sorry about that. I was trying to find my controls. So excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Abugri, for that very interesting talk. As you said, this is a conceptual overview of the relationship between social and economic policy, and it's given us quite a bit of food for thought. So as I said at the beginning, we can take your questions in the chat, or you are also free to raise your hand and speak your questions into the mic. And I hope the host will enable the mics of attendees who want to ask questions. So we'll start with Kamaliza. Please go ahead.
Hi, Nana. Thank you so much. And I want to just reiterate what has been said in the chat, that this was indeed very interesting, very deep analysis of this relationship, and a very excellent way of looking at it. My question would be, so when we're talking about how transformative we can be, we're still focusing on the economics and a bit on the labor side. And my question is this the only way of being transformative? Or is this a specific way that was the focus on this lecture, but there are other alternatives?
Okay, thank you. If the speaker doesn't mind, I'm going to ask for a few more questions and then you could answer them together. So let's allow Margaret to also ask their question.
Yes, thank you, Nana. I would say to Professor Charles that that was a very interesting lecture indeed. But I have two concerns. The first one is about, because Professor was speaking about the liberal model in the as a market, economic market system. So my question is, Professor, you are saying that the liberal model is like against transformative social policies, is one. And as I am from Angola, we have this very atypical system where we have politics very dominant in the economics and the social way of doing things, and we don't have actually a market with this kind of autonomy as we used to see in another countries, perhaps. So my question is, Professor, in those contexts where the politics is very dominant, is very influent, and manage to control so many areas, how we can address the transformative social policy?
Okay.
From where we begin, really. Yeah.
These are kind of heavy questions, so perhaps let me pause here and let Mr. Bukri answer them before we take other questions. As I said, you also please put your questions in the chat. Thanks.
Kamaliza, thanks for the question. I think you are right. I think I picked just a couple of things to be able to handle the topic a bit. But you are right. There are several other ways in which social policy can be transformative, and I can throw out a few, and you probably know a lot more than I do. They include supporting the production and building, productive capacities that are gender conscious, supporting the reproduction of, the reproductive system, as I mentioned earlier, protect the social protection, as we mentioned earlier, redistributing value created through production to solve such social problems as excessive inequalities, so shaping the inequalities context, promoting social integration and addressing conflicts in society, delivering broad-based welfare, as I also mentioned quickly earlier. I think there's several domains that need to be that social policy can contribute to a creating the environment and context in which gender relations are transformed. So that opens up for your own contribution and your own thoughts. On the situation of Mozambique, let me just say that by concentrating on the neoliberal system, I wasn't also suggesting that say other economic systems, including various socialist and communist hybrids, necessarily create address gender inequalities seriously. Some more rhetorical than others, and the same conditions for forced labor could actually apply more rigorously to the exploitation of women's labor, for example. So in each social system, we need to analyze. But you talk specifically about the nature of our politics, that when you have polarized politics, which makes it difficult to have, reflective conversations about public policy choices, and their public policy impacts, then it's difficult to even imagine how social policy can become transformative, because the policy arena is captured by very illiberal and very polarized debates, which in our case also in Ghana, not just by Mozambique, we have a polarized system driven by two parties. They committed the same sorts of policy directions, but very little space for reflective debate. That's clear. In the case of Mozambique, in addition to everything else, you also have a conflict going, and you have a history of long ages where you have a liberation movement party that creates a specific context. So each of these contexts differs, and that's I think that was the real value of this piece of work, that allows us to take a look at the constraints, both at the economic side and the social system side, to transformative social policies that are context driven.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to take a couple more hands and then I'll turn to the questions in the chat. There's a Galaxy. The name is Galaxy, the font. I don't have an actual name. So do you want to ask your question? You have your hand up. So you can unmute your mic. Okay. We'll come back to you then. Marie Fal had a question in the chat. She's asking about the paradox of countries with high economic growth rates, but also high poverty rates. So how do we explain this? I think that's at the heart of what you've been talking about, but perhaps you have a concise answer for her if that's possible. And she's also asking about the informal sector, how it is like dominant in African countries, and she's specifically referring to her country of Senegal, but that the informal sector, the informal economy is not, for the most part of the calculation of GDPs, of the macroeconomic data. And so she wanted to know how we can better incorporate the informal economy in the way that we measure our economies. So I'll let you answer those two questions. The first one is about the disjuncture between high economic growth and yet poverty. And then the second is about the way that the informal economy is discounted and how can we better
Okay, I will also add a third question, which came from, um, uh, I think it was Esther, who asked how. So my question is that you talked about two important buffers for aligning the goals of the market to the social justice, power and might, and the moral principle. So, what are the mechanisms by which there is consensus in the on the moral principle? So I'll deal with that third. So the paradox of high growth and high poverty, I think this is the nature of many of our economies, and there are several different explanations to them, again, depending on context. So, but underlining all of it is the fact that most of these economies are very dependent on the extractive sector, extractive either as minerals or extractive either as a single commodity crops that are produced. And that form of extractive economies is very difficult to spread wealth because it has very limited sideways and backwards linkages and so on. So the one argument about transformational economic policy in order to bring about transformative, social, to bring about social justice is to ensure that the economy is a lot more diversified, and that diversification process is very deliberately done, such that it addresses the underlying inequalities, creating opportunities, various forms of what is called inclusive growth, and that it is does not perpetuate, say, the exploitation of female labor going forward. So transforming economies away from this extractive sector, which people call the rentier economy, basically survives on rents, and economies that do not add that much value. You basically concentrates wealth, and natural resource extraction is the biggest example of this. Secondly, it may well be that the inequality is also founded, the inability to distribute wealth from growth is grounded in a prior condition of inequality. So you take South Africa, for example. The level of inequalities in South Africa, the level of inequalities in Mauritius and Mauritania, and increasing the level of inequalities in Ghana are so high that every additional unit of growth is basically swallowed up by the 1% or 5% at the top. And so trickle down becomes very difficult. And that level of concentration also has another effect, which is that it concentrates political power. So once political power is concentrated in the hands of a few elite, it's difficult to tax them. So in many of our countries, those who actually don't pay tax are the so-called, high income tax-paying units, the large tax-paying units. Big businesses and big and rich individuals don't pay tax. Those who pay most tax are the workers who earn a wage that can be taken from, and consumers who buy from the market, where all sorts of consumption taxes are applied. In such a situation, it is difficult to spread any wealth, to use public expenditure as a mechanism to redistribute wealth or to create opportunities broad enough for the poor and others to benefit. So each of our countries are different, but those are three of the causes, the factors that create this disjunct between fast-growing economies and poverty. Also, do note that economic growth is very deceptive. So, if you have had a civil war, just like we had COVID, the economy seized a bit, and you reopen it, the economic growth grows very rapidly, simply because you are comparing the output of year 1+1 with a very low output, a disaster situation in year 1. So when you keep doing that, or that you have a very small economy with an immediate injection of something major like oil and gas, and the economy keeps bumping, but it has very little to do with the fundamentals of the economy. And so the distributive impacts are very low. Okay, so on the informal economy, not integrated in GDP, increasingly, we make the distinction between the informal economy and the underground economy. The informal economy are largely the things that most of our people survive by. Those who grow a chicken and go to the market, those chickens are counted. Those who have a few bags of maize and yam, those ones are counted. Those who sell bits of things, ice water and those kinds of things on their head, those things are actually quite counted. And if you are a little better and you have a little kiosk, all of a sudden you will be required to register and you have a tax code. Those small businesses, they are informal because the level of turnover is so small that the distribution of that turnover, the returns from it, is insufficient, to reduce poverty. So the real wages are misery wages. They should in fact not be paying taxes because they are too tiny to be part of a bigger formal economy. But there is a large underground economy, which is very illegal economies. Those who smuggle all sorts of things, those who launder money, those who launder children, and the sex trade and the arms trade, and all of those big and and the drugs trade, those are proper underground economies and they are very large. Those are the ones that are not counted into GDP. So we need to make those distinctions between the informal economy, which is small, little economic activities that people survive by, and which are actually counted, and the underground economy, which actually generates large amounts of wealth, which are not counted, except if the country is smart enough to actually register its real estate, the houses, and value them, and tax. Then you will see the differences between the contribution of the formal economy and all of this illegal underground economy that suddenly appear in the form of luxurious mansions. So that is not counted. And that reduces GDP.
Okay. Okay. Did you answer Esther's question?
Okay, so Esther's question. Okay, so you asked, how do we create consensus in this moral economy? And that is the arena of civic society. So civil society presupposes that the aggregation of people in space are willing to dialogue and debate and trade off. That ensures that there is a certain sense of a common good. But because this moral good, individuals cannot, even if you were doing it by yourselves, would get exhausted. That is the role of the state. The purpose, one important purpose of the role of the state is not only that it prevents us from killing each other and that the might rules, but that it reinforces these moral conditions for the economy. That the economy must generate distribution benefits to everybody and generate social justice. So at the heart of it is the role of the state.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to let a couple of people ask their questions and then I'll come back to the chat. So, Professor Fall.
Oui, merci d'avoir répondu à ma question. Moi, ce que je voudrais rajouter, c'est que quand je parle du secteur informel, c'est que je trouve qu'il ne contribue pas aux devises étatiques pour financer des politiques sociales. On voit que dans les pays où on a des États-providence, ben, les recettes de l'État sont tirées des secteurs réguliers d'activité, ce qui permet vraiment une redistribution des richesses et il y en a des fonds qui sont disponibles. Mais dans nos pays, puisque le secteur informel est très grand, très vaste, mais ne contribue vraiment pas aux recettes fiscales. Il y a beaucoup de pertes, beaucoup de pertes fiscales qui est faite, de sorte que nos États n'ont pas les moyens de financer des politiques sociales. Donc, je me demande si ce n'est pas nécessaire de régulariser le secteur informel, d'autant plus qu'on voit que dans les inégalités de revenus, on va voir des chefs d'entreprise qui ne sont pas enregistrés, ben, avoir des revenus très grands comparativement à des personnes qui travaillent dans le système régulier, mais qui payent des impôts. Donc, cela aussi contribue d'une certaine façon à renforcer les inégalités dans nos pays. C'est vraiment le questionnement que je fais, c'est-à-dire, est-ce qu'il n'est pas nécessaire de régulariser le secteur informel de sorte que nos États puissent avoir plus de recettes pour payer certaines politiques sociales pour les communautés déshéritées?
I was looking for my translation button and I didn't get it, so you will have to translate.
Oh, okay. It was more of a comment really than
A question.
than a question.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I thought people had, I should tell everybody. So there is a translation options at the bottom of your screen, and you can toggle between English and French if you need to, or just keep it on the English channel if you are listening in English, and the French channel if you need it in French, and then you will catch the translations when they come. So it was, can I capture everything? It was a comment basically reiterating her earlier question that the informal sector is not really taken fully into account in sort of the way that we formally assess the economy. And I think she heard your response to the question that she made, but I think she has a different perspective, that there's still a lot of informal sector work that gets
Sure.
yes, that gets ignored or does
excluded.
not excluded. That's
Yeah.
a good word, and I'm not sure that that's something that we can necessarily argue with.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for that. And so I'm going to go to the chat. I think the person we called earlier who couldn't speak sent something in the chat. So his or her question had to do more with, it's sort of like the sum, maybe it should come at the end, because they're asking, given the reality that a lot of our economic and social policies, in his words or her words, are remote controlled from outside, how do we make space for ourselves as African countries to make policies that can be truly corrective and transformative? And if you like, I can also have a couple more people ask their questions, so you can take them all together. So John Otiamwa, who's one of the postdocs on the GESPA project, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles, for this insightful presentation. In responding to one of the questions, you mentioned the role of the state and how the state can help in promoting transformative social protection. But I want to find out, what about in situations where the state itself is the one perpetuating or creating the injustice as a result of partly, probably because of unsustainable debt, among other things? So where should we really situate the state? Because the state sometimes becomes the perpetrator of the injustice. Thank you.
Okay, you can go ahead.
I should respond, right?
Yes, and please, you can respond to this one, what
Yeah.
John just asked, and then perhaps the first question I asked about what do we do can be the final word.
Okay. So there are actually three questions. The first one was, okay, the last one. Yeah, how do we make space for transformation of transformative social? Let me start with this role of the state question. So and this has always been our biggest problem as a neo-colonial state for a very long time, and it was the same process we went through, whether or not to to go with the Lagos Plan of Action for sorting out our economic and political problems, or whether to go for IMF and World Bank loans and structural adjustment. And so, as neo-colonial states, I suppose we are all acutely aware of the pools and the pull and pulls. And so, how do we address this? Well, we address this by engaging in the domestic public policy and shaping our political institutions and not giving up and taking the fight. And if there are opportunity to vote people out, we vote them out. If there's no opportunity to vote them out, we still have to find a way to do popular uprising and throw them out. So somehow the state has to be responsive to people's, and part of civil society is to make sure. By civil society, I don't mean NGOs, but just the civil society, that our role is to help shape the state to serve social justice. So I'm not sure that I can answer more than that. And each one of our societies, how we even if sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it takes peaceful means, sometimes it takes violent means, but it's part of the political science of shaping our states. We all know, and there are no easy answers in that sense. So, for example, the Ghana situation of debt, debt accumulation. I mean, some of us will argue that it's not the debt accumulation per se. I mean, it really doesn't matter if you borrow money, if you put the money into good use. So if the debate becomes you are borrowing too much, doesn't make sense. Too much relative to what? But you are spending the money corruptly and you are misapplying it, and it is not generating the results that borrowing money is supposed to have generated to grow the economy, put people in schools, build skills, do the infrastructure so that years down the line it's a better economy, provide opportunities for more. Then it's a good thing to borrow. And you should borrow not just foreign debt, you should borrow from domestically as well, especially from the central bank, which is the government body created to help create money and bail out the government, which that's so in a sense, the civil society can frame the debate a bit more differently, and push that accountability in government. So Kojo, I'm not sure that I could say more than this. So the last question is well, similar. Given that we are in neo-colonial states and there's a lot of external interference, and how do we create space for social policy? Occasionally, some governments pop out for a short period that seem willing to take risks and break from the colonial mold for a while and then collapses back. But how do they emerge? Well, they can't emerge without popular pressure, without the political context to create them. So it's still the same as the first question. If we say we are democratic institutions, we vote people in and so on, and then we vote in the people who continuously squeeze the space for transformative social policy and exacerbate inequalities and repression. Well, it means that our civic society hasn't quite matured to a point. At some point, and hopefully, the demographic shifts will force some public pressure that recalibrates the attitude and responsibility of the state. But there are also some good signs sometimes. For example, increasingly, not long ago, industrial policy, which is the role of the state in helping our economies to diversify, basically by providing targeted support for industry, was anathema. It didn't happen. But increasingly, in many countries, they're using industrial policy. It may well be that it's benefiting, some political players. Nevertheless, there is room for industrial policy. There's probably more room to do things than we presume. There's a lot of room to provide tariff support for local policies. But of course, if we do so too big, we will have a backlash. But if you really want to fight it, you can fight it. After all, the Nigerians have put high tariffs on the importation of rice and total bans in order to grow their rice and poultry sector. So sometimes it's not just the neo-colonial control of our public policy. It is that the leaders of our public policy are completely sold into that way of managing economies. And when they have other ideas and they want to implement, they actually do implement. And the consequences are not as big as you would think they would be. Industrial policy is one, and trade protection and tariffs is another. It is our responsibility to push them towards being more rebellious for the sake of economic and social transformation.
Okay.
That's all I
Thank
can
you.
say, Kuya.
No, that's a lot you have said. Thank you very much. And I love the last line about pushing our states to be more rebellious of the outside constraints. Okay, we do have one final question. This is coming from Sameva Abomo, and it is going to be in French. So, Mr. Bupi, have you found your translation button?
Yes, I have.
Okay, great. So, please, Prof. Abomo, please go ahead. Are you speaking? We can't hear you.
Allô? Oui,
Yes,
oui, bonjour. J'ai une
we can hear you now.
contribution et une question. Premièrement, il y a une question qui a été posée relative à la dimension beaucoup plus économique qui est présentée. C'est vrai, une politique sociale transformatrice, la transformation ne se restreint pas seulement à l'aspect économique, mais elle est portée par l'économie. C'est pour cela que, en expliquant bien comment ressortir, comment réveiller l'aspect économique, ça pourra avoir des répercussions sur les autres aspects de la transformation. Donc, c'est une contribution que je voulais apporter. Ma préoccupation est relative à l'implication des collectivités territoriales décentralisées. Parce que les pays africains sont beaucoup plus en train de déverser vers la décentralisation, et un peu comme un slogan politique et autres. Or, la décentralisation est un véritable levier de transformation sociétale. Les politiques sociales peuvent justement intégrer et exploiter même cette décentralisation. Supposons par exemple la municipalisation d'un certain nombre de missions de l'État. Si vraiment l'État central libère, transfère les pouvoirs et les compétences aux collectivités territoriales, les mairies peuvent jouer un rôle déterminant. Au mieux, est-ce que les mairies ne peuvent pas jouer un rôle déterminant dans l'essor des politiques sociales transformatrices et genrées? Parce que quand tout est centralisé à l'État, on a l'impression que l'État s'essouffle et ne peut pas agir à des proximités. Alors, professeur Charles, merci pour l'exposé qui est très, très intéressant. Qu'en est-il des mairies, la dynamique des politiques sociales transformatrices et genrées?
Mr. Bupi, did you get that?
Yes, I got that.
Can you respond?
I think both of them were actually largely, except the last bit of the question, are some reflections which I agree with. The first one being that, the economy is important for social policy. So the same, so that I totally agree. The second one is the importance of decentralization and decentralized approaches to addressing social policy, which I also agree with. And the question is, why is our decentralization processes failing? And that's really the question.
Mm.
And I think each of us have a different answer to that, depending on our situation. In some places, it is just that central government decentralizes by name, but don't devolve the resources. So fiscal devolution hasn't followed all that political administrative devolution. And even when there's a certain measure of fiscal devolution, the transfers problem is serious, that they either don't transfer the share of local government money to the local government entities, or that the transfers are very temperamental, which is that they are not smooth. Sometimes they don't transfer towards the end of the year, and it's impossible to plan. Third factor, from what I have been reading, is that the roles sometimes given to the decentralized bodies far outweigh the resources that are allocated to them. So they're basically set up to fail. And so they create a lot of local expectations without the ability and opportunity to actually deliver. And differently for each of our countries, there's also political interferences that make local government systems not function. So when you transfer the national level politics in not a very smooth way to the local level, sometimes you end up with the worst of central government politics at the local government level, and without the local government actually benefiting from the best, of the democratic competitive process. And then finally, we also have to know that, look, decentralization and even with fiscal devolution, that doesn't have, a formula for redistribution, which is, a formula that goes to areas of poverty more than others. Decentralization can also even end up questioning the inequality factor. And for gender purposes, some of the biggest, manifestations of patriarchy is very localized. And without social movements and social organizations and strong women's movement, strong decentralized actors could just end up, reinforcing male dominance at multiple levels. So at each of our countries, we need to take a look at why decentralization is not working, what bits of it is working, which bits of it may actually be exacerbating gender inequalities, and which bits of it need to be reinforced.
That's really interesting. Marie echoed one of the comments you made about decentralization of rules without the resources go along with it. But I thought the other reasons that she gave were interesting, particularly about the last bit about how decentralization might end up reinforcing gender inequalities if the decentralized actors, because we seem to assume good intentions for decentralized actors, right? This, at least in my head, the perception seems to be that the state is too autocratic and may not have the best interest of local people at heart, but people at the ground level will know what is best for them and will do what is best for them. But I don't know why I would make that assumption. So I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so very, very finally, we had Julius Omona wanting to say something. So that would be the very final question or comment before we wrap up. Julius, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Nana. Thank you, the presenter, Mr. Charles. I've learned quite a lot in your presentation. It has been so informative. In fact, I've heard about palliative social policy today, and it It has excited me a lot. But if I can take you back to some of the recommendations you made, that in order to ensure transformative, gender equitable social policies, one of the things to be done is the organization of women and the feminist groups for political influence. Yeah, I agree with you on this. To organize women is very important so that they champion the cause of fellow women. But if I can tell you briefly about our experience as a country, Uganda, you find in the last several years under this current government, women have been given political space, and in order to have, of course, political influence, and mainly they have been coming on the ticket of women, that they will champion the cause for women. So right now, as I speak, we have even a prime minister who is a woman, we have a vice president who is a woman, we have a deputy speaker who is a woman, and even at all other levels of government, in parliament, there are quite a big number, the local government, in cabinet. But over the years, there has been also some complaint about these so-called elite women or women in the political space by fellow women, that they go on the ticket of women, but once they're already there, they forget about fellow women, they abandon the cause for women, and in many cases, they have been accused of just colluding with men and to just champion their selfish interests. They ignore the cause for women. In other words, they have been like accused for being the cause of injustice. So my question is, in the face of this kind of action by these so-called elite women, they are supposed to be organizing themselves, or they should be organized in order to address the plight of women. But if they are the one now who are turning like the cause of injustice, who should do the organizing of these women and feminist group to address the plight of women? I think this is a common thing in many of the countries. Who should do this organization? Because they themselves who are there, they are failing to organize.
Right.
So who should be doing it? Thank you.
Mr. Abu.
So, I was in Pakwach for 3 years, from 1989 to 1992, at the height of the early stages of Museveni's revolution. So, you know Pakwach in Jonam Tere.
Yes, that's close to where I come from.
Okay, so I lived there. And the one thing that was most exciting to me in those days was the opportunity for women to organize at the very local level. That emphasis on the local level organizing and space for voice of women did a lot of wonders. You know, Jonam is a bit like my village in northern Ghana, where women do a lot of kneeling. You know that. And it was, I mean, after 1 year, the atmosphere for conversations completely changed. I mean, they weren't rank cross, but it was conversation. There were face for women's voices and so on. So my point is this, that if that bottom-up, grassroots-based movements of women have broken, maybe that's the level of effort that needs to happen again to continuously renew the women's movement. And I bet that there are feminist groups that could do that. It's best done by feminist organizations themselves, bringing in and so on. So I believe that can be. But also do keep in mind that sometimes the focus on the elite women letting down other women can sometimes be itself very gendered. In the way that you don't say about elite men letting out poor, poor men. So it's that elite is elite, and the accountability of politicians to their people pervades and affects both the role of men and the few women who you say. I also bet that if you did an asset survey across Uganda, maybe the asset ownership question would probably not have changed remarkably. Those who own the Bayankole cows, for example, the main source of wealth, those who own the land, I don't think in the years that we were trying to organize in Zonam County, we managed to touch anything on the land, and even the ownership of boats for the fishing on the Blue Nile. So there's another level of organizing that, that needs to happen. And it's a continuous renewal, of issues of power relations that affect both women-led organizations and even progressive male-led organizations. So that's our task, Pomona. So we should probably join one of the feminist groups and help out.
Too early.
So
Thank you.
so should I.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so very much. And we've come to 3:30, and I think this has been a really good mix of a great presentation, a thought-provoking presentation that has also then provoked good discussion, good questions, good comments and thoughts. So I want to first of all thank Mr. Bugri again for giving us this presentation, which I know is the prelude, is part of his preparation for putting together an issues paper on this same topic for the GESPA project. So we'll look forward to reading that. In the meantime, I know that you sent your presentation to Esther at the GESPA Secretariat. A number of people have asked for the presentation. Again, just a testament to how good it was. So I believe Esther will be sending it out to everybody in the project. So we've got that. So thank you, Mr. Bugri, again, and I want to thank everybody who made it for this webinar, the very first in the series. We hope to be able to advertise another one soon. You'll get the emails. I was trying to remember when the next date was, but I can't quite recall it at this moment. But Esther, as usual, will send out emails with all the details that are necessary. So once again, thank you all so much for taking an hour and a half out of your afternoon to come listen. And thanks again to Mr. Bugri, and thanks to the GESPA Secretariat for putting all of this together. Have a good afternoon.